Now, as we've mentioned in the programme, President Macron is hosting foreign leaders here in Paris for a summit focusing on how to help the world's poorest countries deal with increasingly catastrophic events linked to climate change without being saddled with huge debts. The big focus is on potential reform of decades-old system of the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, so there's a facility for countries to access some kind of climate finance funding. One of the key members of this summit is today's prospective guest, Laurence Tubiana, one of the architects of the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015, President of the European Climate Foundation. Laurence, good to have you with us. First, set out for us the aim of today's summit.
I think there is two important things of this summit. One is to break the taboo that we cannot change anything in the international financial architecture. And that's very important because at almost 20 years we are discussing that World Bank has to be reformed, IMF as well, because the world has changed. Countries like, for example, Barbados, we are not existing in 1944. And that's the Prime Minister, Maya Motley, who is calling for the reform. So, and of course, we have many, many more examples. And now there are financial centers, whether the Islamic Development Bank, for example, or the new banks that Brazil or China or others have created, and that's now the new system. So that's one, break the taboo, discuss things, even the extreme concentration of wealth which have been witnessing since the last 10 years, and in particular the 2021 and 2022, and this wealth is not contributing to really support and be in solidarity with the main victims of climate change. And in particular, of course, the oil and gas sector. I can take the example of the maritime sector, who is not paying any tax, and who is, of course, if it was a country, it will be the sixth more polluting country. So there are inconsistencies in the system, whereas countries are defeated by extreme events, they are indebted, and we are pushing them to borrow more to ensure and finance this transition to a clean world, a clean energy, a clean industry. But they can't, because the cost is just too high. So we need international solidarity.
So we're looking at something huge, actually, the scale of this, because if you look at we talk about the global financing system, I think you've mentioned before, well, actually go back to Bretton Woods, the agreement back in the 40s after the Second World War, creation of the IMF, creation of the World Bank. It pitted every currency pretty much to the US dollar. And what we've seen since then is actually a few changes, but what they're trying to do here is have a huge overhaul so that there's a funding facility available for these poorer countries. Just explain how that could work.
So that the first issue is, again, to push the momentum everywhere, because there are many places where these reforms are discussed. Second is to try to unlock key short-term issues, like, for example, suspension of debt payments when there are extreme events, because just countries cannot pay. Second, try to find new source of money, because there is no miracle, there is no fiscal space available. That's why another taboo, which is international taxes, would be discussed at that summit. I'm not, of course, particularly optimistic about the immediate result, but for example, on the maritime sector, I think we can advance very much in this summit. And then we could have many more innovation and discuss things like we need guarantee for the private capital to come in these countries where they feel it's too risky, and that's why countries have to borrow with interest rates which are sometimes 10 times the price any developed country will pay for the international market.
Now, you're a seasoned player in this. You've seen summits come and go. Just give me your assessment of the reality. One hand, we're seeing these leaders and foreign ministers coming into the summit. It's a good talking shop. It looks good at first. But what you talked about emissions potentially on the shipping industry, one tangible thing, tax there. But in terms of the big players like China, for example, a big creditor to these smaller countries in Latin America, often exchanging money in exchange for minerals and wealth, are they involved? You know, how do you see this as a success?
Well, there are, again, short-term results. For example, making the agreement with China on the indebted country like Zambia, and I hope they will announce that they finally found an agreement with the Paris Club, meaning the traditional G7 creditors, and China, who was not involved in these processes. So I think we can get there, which will be a major step forward. The second one is certainly, again, to push the different milestone. We have G20 in India the World Bank meetings in October in Marrakesh and the COP 28 in Dubai, all this moment we will just push this agenda more and more. It was really a breakthrough last year when in Sharm el-Sheikh, this famous Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which is to put the finance in the service of the fight against climate change, was not really embedded in any process. And now it is. So I think it's a progress at least.
As we were talking, the man arriving at the summit behind you, not afraid to pull his punches on the state of how he sees the world. Antonio Guterres, head of the UN, saying that the Secretary-General, that it's pitiful, the world effort, the way we're going is catastrophically running towards a climate catastrophe. When you look back at what you achieved at the climate agreement of curbing emissions back in 2015, what do you think the worth is now of the climate agreement back then? Has it been completely devalued?
On one side, I would say we are running so late. But anyway, we did this Paris Agreement with many essays and errors before in 2015. It was too late, frankly. We would have done that 20 years earlier. It would have much more. It's easier because the transition is very difficult. We are facing strong headwinds. Never again, the fossil fuel sector in general is pretty well established now and it's not the first time they are really taking the scene, and they are the ones who really are shaping the world economy. It's not the first time, but at the same time, the level of catastrophe is really increasing. So I think it's a moment of truth. Or we are serious in this decade or not. Or they are serious, they cannot just continue polluting without paying for that. So for me, it's a wake-up call for this summit, certainly.
Let me ask you a brief question. It's a difficult question to end on, but I'd like your thoughts. We're going towards what we call, the clean transition, but there is a dark side to clean energy, the pollution, the mining, the localized pollution from it. How comfortable are you with the state of the transition and where we're going at the moment?
I think the good thing is we are now looking at the downside of this transition, which is exactly the pollution, sometimes the human rights abuses in many countries, and at the same time, the high dependency we have now many countries have vis-à-vis China, because that's 70% of the supply chain, which is controlled by China now, which is in a way not secure for any reason. So I think it's an eye-opener. I think mining, of course, has to be done anyway, but if we don't want to be kept in this extractive mindset, which is a fossil fuel is, we have to understand and be much more clever, to be more, sober in the way we consume, to recycle every gram of this precious material we are extracting, and that's a totally new economy.
Laurence Tubiana, the President of the European Climate Foundation, thank you so much for your time. And just a